I walked into my own daughter's retirement celebration, carrying a card that held 50 years of memories, and my son-in-law stopped me at the door of the banquet hall with a smile so thin it could have cut glass. "Graham," Neil said, keeping his voice low so the couple greeting guests nearby wouldn't hear. "There's been a mix-up with the seating. We weren't expecting you tonight." I looked at him for a moment. The hall was warm and full. I could hear Diane's laugh somewhere inside, the one she inherited from her mother. "I had driven 2 hours from Sudbury in November sleet to be there," I said. "I understand, son," and then I turned around and walked back to my car. I did not call anyone. I sat in the parking lot of the Fairmont in downtown Ottawa, and I listened to the freezing rain hit the windshield. In my breast pocket, folded once, was a handwritten card. On the front I had drawn a small heron, badly, I'll admit, because Diane had loved herons since she was 7 years old, and used to sit with me at the edge of Georgian Bay waiting for them to land. Inside the card I had written 2 sentences, nothing elaborate. Just what I meant. I put the car in drive at 7:14 in the evening, and I called my solicitor, Edmund Farr, who had been handling my affairs since before Diane was born. Edmund picked up on the 3rd ring. He said, "Graham, aren't you supposed to be at the party?" I said, "Trigger the Heronwood provisions." There was a pause. Then he said, very quietly, "I'll have everything ready by morning. My name is Graham Alderton. I'm 68 years old. I spent 31 years building Alderton timber into one of the largest privately held forestry operations in northern Ontario. I have a daughter named Diane, who is 41, and a son-in-law named Neil Strachan, who I paid for more times than I ever counted. And for the better part of the last 2 years, I have been learning, slowly and with great cost, that the people you build everything for are not always the people who deserve it. Let me tell you exactly how it happened. My wife, Ruth, died in March 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. We had 43 years together, and she was the better half of every single one of them. She kept the garden and kept the books and kept me honest, and when she was gone, the house in Sudbury felt like a building someone had taken all the furniture out of. Same walls, same floors, just hollow. Diane called every Sunday for the first few months. Neil was polite on the few occasions he got on the line. They came up for Thanksgiving that first year, and it was a quiet weekend, gentle, the kind where everyone is trying not to say the wrong thing. I understood. Grief makes people careful. It was in January, about 10 months after Ruth passed, that Neil first came to see me alone. He drove up on a Wednesday afternoon and sat across from me at the kitchen table I'd had for 30 years. He had a folder with him, the kind with the elastic band around it, and he set it on the table like it was a gift. He told me there was an opportunity, a co-working development in Kanata, new build, strong anchor tenants already committed. He said some of his partners were putting together a limited liability partnership, and there were 2 spots left for private investors. He said the projected return over 5 years was substantial. He used the word substantial 4 times in 20 minutes. I said, "Neil, I'm 66 years old and I just lost my wife. I'm not looking to park money in an Ottawa real estate venture." He nodded. He said he understood completely. He closed the folder. And then he said, "I wasn't going to bring this up yet, but Diane's been struggling. The cost of the practice expansion has been higher than projected, and there's a cash flow problem that's putting real stress on both of us. I thought if the investment worked for you, it might help us at the same time." I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said anything. He picked up his folder and looked at the table. I said, "How much does Diane need?" He told me. I wrote the check before he got back to Ottawa. I want to be clear about something. I am not a stupid man. I ran a forestry operation with 140 employees and contracts in 3 provinces. I negotiated with mill owners and government ministers and union stewards who would eat a man alive if he showed any softness. But Neil did not come to my boardroom. He came to my kitchen. He came 10 months after I lost Ruth, when the house was still hollow, and Diane's voice on the phone was the only sound in it that reminded me of anything good. He came as my son-in-law, and I let the father in me take the wheel. That was the first transfer. $230,000. Over the following 14 months, there were 4 more. Each one had a story. Diane's dental practice needed updated imaging equipment. A tax dispute required a bridge loan, while their accountants sorted it out. There was a problem with the Kannada development that required original investors to contribute a top-up to avoid losing their position entirely. Each time Neil came to me with quiet, reasonable urgency. Each time Diane sent a text the following day that said something like, "Dad, thank you. I don't know what we would do without you." I believed her. Why would I not? By October of this year, I had transferred a total of $680,000 into various accounts Neil directed me toward. I had not asked for statements. I had not involved Edmund. I had not asked to see the dental practice books or the development registrations or any of the documentation that in any other context I would have demanded before writing a check for $30. That is the part that keeps me up at night. Not what they did, what I allowed. The retirement celebration was Diane's idea, or so I was told. She had been the lead dentist at her Barhaven practice for 12 years and had recently brought in a partner, which apparently freed her from clinical duties 2 days a week. Neil told me she wanted to market properly. A dinner at the Fairmont for 80 guests, colleagues and friends and family. He mentioned it in passing during a call in September. He said, "We'd love to have you there, obviously. Your family." I drove down the morning of the event. I had booked a room at the hotel so I wouldn't have to drive back in the dark. I'd bought a new tie, navy, because Ruth always said I looked best in navy. I'd written the card with the heron on it. I was, if I'm being honest, looking forward to it. I had been alone in the Sudbury house for a long time, and the thought of sitting at a table full of people who loved my daughter felt like something to aim at. When Neil stopped me at the door, my first thought was administrative. A seating chart error. A capacity issue with the fire code. Some honest confusion that would be resolved in 30 seconds. But his eyes were wrong. There was no embarrassment in them. There was calculation. He said, "This really isn't a good time to work through it, Graham. The evening is already underway. Maybe you could join us for coffee tomorrow morning." I said, "I understand, son," and I left. In the parking lot, sitting in the sleet, I went back through the previous 2 years. And the thing about sitting alone in a cold car at night, with nothing to do but think, is that the picture comes together faster than you expect. I called Edmund and I triggered the Heronwood provisions. Heronwood is the name of the property on Georgian Bay, where Ruth and I spent every August for 20 years. After she died, I had Edmund restructure my estate. The Heronwood provisions were a set of conditional clauses we had embedded in the family trust. The kind of thing Edmund had proposed years earlier, and I had always thought of as overly cautious. The provisions meant that any beneficiary designation tied to my estate could be frozen, reviewed, and restructured at my sole discretion if I had documented cause to believe my assets were being managed against my interests. Edmund had called it an insurance policy. I had called it paranoia. I had signed it anyway. When I triggered it that night, it meant that the joint trust account Neil had been steering funds toward, the one I had not fully examined in 14 months, went into administrative lockdown before midnight. It also meant that Edmund could begin pulling the transaction logs from every transfer I had authorized. He called me at 6 the next morning. I was already awake, sitting at the small desk in my hotel room, watching the Ottawa River go gray in the early light. "Graham," he said, "you need to come to the office." "How bad?" "Come to the office." Edmund's firm was on Elgin Street, 3 floors up, in a building that smelled like old carpet and competence. He met me at the elevator in his shirt sleeves, which told me everything about the kind of night he'd had. We went into the conference room. There was coffee, black, already poured. There were papers on the table. He walked me through it without softening anything. The dental practice expansion was real. The imaging equipment was real. But the amounts I had transferred were significantly more than those costs. The remainder, more than $420,000, had been routed through a numbered company incorporated in Alberta that Edmund's investigator had traced in the overnight hours. The company was called Strachan Capital Holdings. It had one director, Neil. The Kannada development had been sold 18 months ago. The investors, including Neil's partners, had been bought out. There were no open positions. The co-working project was finished and profitable, and Neil had received his return. He had taken my top-up contribution and absorbed it into his personal gain without telling me the investment had already closed. I sat with that for a moment, Through the window, I could see the war memorial. A man was walking a dog along the path below, bundled against the cold. Normal Tuesday morning. Is there more? I asked. Edmund set a folder in front of me. Inside was a copy of a power of attorney document. My signature was on the last page. I had signed it in August. Neil had brought it to me alongside a set of estate planning documents I had been meaning to update since Ruth's death. He told me it was a standard provision, allowing Diane to make financial decisions on my behalf in the event I was incapacitated. He said the lawyer who prepared it was a friend of theirs who specialized in elder care planning. He said it was a gift, really, something Ruth would have wanted in place. I had signed without calling Edmund. That was the one that sat in my stomach like a stone. Is it valid? I asked. Edmund said, not anymore, but it was active for 3 months. During that time, Neil used it twice. Once to redirect a GIC renewal from your personal account into the Alberta numbered company. Once to authorize himself as a signing officer on a subsidiary account connected to the trust. He paused. He was building a structure, Graham. If this had gone on another 6 months, he would have had enough authority and enough of your capital transfer to make things very difficult to unwind. I asked Edmund if there was any chance Diane didn't know. He looked at me in the way that people look at you when they are deciding whether to be honest. The numbered company has 2 beneficial owners, he said, Neil and Diane. I drove back to the hotel and sat on the edge of the bed for a while. Not crying. I'm not much of a crier, but there's a kind of grief that isn't about sadness exactly. It's about the specific weight of understanding something that you cannot unknow. I had loved Diane since before she was born. I used to carry her on my shoulders along the shore at Heronwood, and she would say she was taller than the trees. She was not wrong. I thought about the card in my breast pocket with the heron on it, and I thought about the 2 sentences I had written inside. I thought about Ruth, who would have known. Ruth always knew. I thought about what I was going to do. I am not a man who performs his anger. I never have been. The forestry business teaches you that the people who shout lose. The people who wait and prepare and execute precisely are the ones who are still standing when the season turns. I made 2 calls. The first was to Edmund. The second was to my grandson, Callum. Callum is Diane's son from her first marriage before Neil. He's 24, works in IT security in Toronto. He and I have always been close in the way that skips a generation. Comfortable with each other, easy. He called Diane Mom and Neil, never Dad, and that distinction which I had never thought much about before, suddenly seemed important. Callum answered on the first ring and I said, I need to see you in person. It's important and it's about your mother. I need you to not mention to her or Neil that I called. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'll take the train up tomorrow. While I waited for Callum, I went back through every document I could find. Edmund had already pulled the transaction logs, but I had my own records. I keep everything. Always have. Old habit from the timber business, where a handshake contract could turn into a lawsuit inside a year. I went through 2 years of emails and bank notifications and text messages from Diane and pieced together the timeline. The texts from Diane were the hardest part. They were warm. They thanked me. They said things like, you've always been there for us, and I wish Mum could see how well things are going. I sat with those texts for a long time. I thought about whether someone could write those words while also being part of what Neil was building. I thought about whether Diane was a full partner in this, or whether Neil had found a way to involve her enough to make her complicit without telling her everything. I did not know the answer yet, but I intended to find out. Callum arrived the following afternoon. He sat across from me in the hotel restaurant, and I laid it out for him without drama. The transfers, the numbered company, the power of attorney, the beneficial ownership, the night at the Fairmont door. He listened. He is a serious young man, Callum. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he sat back and he said, how much do you know about their finances outside of what you gave them? I said, not much. He said, I might be able to help with that. I asked him what he meant. He told me that 3 months ago, Diane had asked him to help set up cloud storage for the practice. He'd done it as a favor. In the process, he had seen files he wasn't meant to see, files that he had not looked at but now, given what I just told him, felt relevant. I didn't read them, he said, but I remember the folder names. One of them was Alderton transfer records. The air in the restaurant changed. "Callum," I said, "I need you to be very careful here." He nodded. He was already thinking. "There are legal ways to do this," he said. "Let me call someone I trust." 3 days later, through Edmund and Callum's contact, a digital forensics specialist who worked with law firms on financial fraud cases, we had a clearer picture. The Alderton transfer records folder contained a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet tracked every dollar I had given, when, and where it had gone. Next to each entry were columns for allocated, cleared, and available. It had been maintained with the kind of care that people reserve for things they intend to keep hidden and then one day access without anyone questioning where the money came from. There was also a second document. It was a draft letter addressed to the Ontario Securities Commission. The letter, which had never been sent, alleged that I had been experiencing significant cognitive decline over the past 18 months, and that concerns existed about my capacity to manage my estate without supervision. The letter asked the Commission to flag my account activity and referred to my increasingly erratic financial decisions. It was signed by Diane. It had never been sent. Edmund believed they were holding it in reserve, a contingency in case I questioned the transfers or tried to claw anything back. If they sent it, any dispute I raised could be framed as the confused protest of an old man who couldn't track his own finances. It was a weapon kept in a drawer, ready. I sat in Edmund's office and read that draft letter twice. I thought about Ruth again. I thought about Diane at 7 years old waiting for the herons. I thought about all the space between that girl and the woman who had typed those words. Then I thought about what needed to happen next. Edmund had already frozen the Strachan Capital Holdings account. The power of attorney was void. The beneficiary designations were suspended under the Heronwood provisions. Neil and Diane did not know any of this. As far as they were aware, I had gone home to Sudbury embarrassed and confused, the way they had apparently decided I was supposed to be. Monday morning, the annual trustees meeting for the Alderton Family Trust was scheduled. Edmund had arranged it months ago, a standard review. Neil had been added as an observer 2 years prior at Diane's request since he was assisting with financial coordination. He had no vote, but he attended. He liked to attend. I had an idea about how to make that meeting useful. I did not sleep much that weekend. I stayed in Ottawa, taking meals alone, walking along the canal in the cold. I have always thought better on my feet, and there was a great deal to think through. On Sunday evening, I called Callum and asked him to come to the trustees' meeting on Monday. I told him what I needed him to do and where to sit. I also called a woman named Sandra Okafor, who was the lead investigator at the Financial Crimes Unit of the Ontario Provincial Police, and who had been put in contact with me by Edmund's colleague. She had reviewed the documents. She was ready. I dressed carefully on Monday morning. Dark suit, the navy tie. I looked like a man who knew exactly where he was going. Edmund's conference room was the same one we had sat in 4 days earlier. The papers on the table were different now. Neil arrived first, which surprised me. He was usually late. He looked relaxed. He sat at the far end, opened a leather notebook, and clicked his pen. He did not seem concerned that I was there. He must have assumed that whatever had happened at the Fairmont had resolved in his favor, that I had gone home uncertain and ashamed. Diane arrived 5 minutes later. She stopped when she saw me. A complicated expression moved across her face, something between relief and alarm, and she said, "Dad, I didn't know you'd be here." I said, "I always attend the trustees' meeting, Diane. I'm the trustee." She sat down. Neil had gone very still. Edmund opened the meeting. He thanked everyone for being present. He said there were some significant matters to address regarding recent account activity and beneficial ownership disclosures. He set a stack of folders on the table and began distributing them. Neil opened his folder, looked at the first page, and I watched his face change. Callum walked in at that moment and sat quietly along the wall. Neil looked at him, then at me. The click of his pen stopped. Edmund walked through everything, methodically, without drama, the way a good solicitor does. The numbered company, the redirected GIC, the impersonated signing authority, the Strachan Capital Holdings account, and its 2 beneficial owners. He explained that the power of attorney document had been reviewed and voided due to procedural irregularities in its preparation. It had been notarized by an individual whose license had lapsed the year before. He placed the draft OSC letter in the center of the table. The room was very quiet. Neil said, "I'd like to speak to a lawyer." I said, "That's wise." Diane had not spoken. She was looking at the table. Her hands were flat on the surface in front of her, very still, the way hands look when someone is trying to hold something together. Neil tried once more. He looked at me and he said, "Graham, this is a misunderstanding. There are explanations for all of this. You're grieving. You've been confused about a lot of things since Ruth. Let us help you." I said, "Neil." He stopped. I said, "You don't get to use her name." I had not planned to say that. It came from somewhere quieter and older than strategy. But it was true, and I meant it, and the room felt it. The door opened. Sandra Okafor and a colleague stepped in. Edmund had called them at the start of the meeting. Neil's chair scraped back. He stood up, and then he seemed to understand that there was nowhere to go, and he sat back down. Diane made a sound I had not heard from her since she was a child, a single sharp intake of breath, the kind that comes before tears. She looked at me and said, "Dad." I said, "I know." She said, "I didn't." "The letter, I didn't know he was going to," Neil said sharply. "Diane." She stopped. And the fact that she stopped, that she listened to him even then, in that room with the evidence on the table, and the investigators by the door, that told me what I needed to know about the question I had been carrying all weekend. She had not been a reluctant passenger. She had made her choices. She had her own column in the spreadsheet. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. I thought about everything. Then I said, "You should get a lawyer too." Neil was arrested and charged that morning. Wire fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, misuse of power of attorney. The Alberta company was frozen pending investigation. Diane was not arrested that day. The investigators needed more time to determine the extent of her involvement. But she was told not to leave the province, and her professional registration was flagged pending review by the Royal College of Dental Surgeons. Edmund and I stayed in the conference room after everyone else had left. He poured 2 coffees, and we sat the way we've sat through hard things before, not saying much. The silence between us, the kind that's earned over decades. After a while, I said, "The Heronwood property. I want it excluded from any estate review. I want it placed into a standalone trust, different structure." Edmund said, "In whose name?" I said, "Callum." Edmund nodded. He wrote it down. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the card I had been carrying since the night I drove down from Sudbury. The heron, the bad drawing, the 2 sentences inside. I set it on the table. I did not open it. I just looked at it. Then I folded it once more and put it back in my pocket. I drove home to Sudbury on a Tuesday afternoon in November. The highway was dry for once, and the sky above the Canadian Shield was that deep particular blue you only get in the cold months, almost violent in its clarity. I stopped once, at a Tim Hortons outside Parry Sound. I got a coffee, and I sat for a few minutes watching transport trucks move north. Ruth would have had something to say about all of it. She had never fully trusted Neil. She said once, very quietly, that he listened to people in the way that salesmen listen, waiting for the information they could use. I had thought she was being uncharitable. I think about that now. Callum called me when I was 20 minutes from home. He said, "Grandpa, you okay?" I said I was. He said, "I'm coming up on Friday, if that's all right." I said, "I'll make the guest room." He said, "I thought we could go out to the bay, check if the herons are still around." I said they probably weren't, it being November too cold. He said that was fine, we could just look. I pulled into the driveway at dusk. The house was dark the way it always is now, all the lights off because there is no one else inside. But I did not feel hollow the way I sometimes do. I sat in the car for a moment with the engine off and the quiet of the street around me, and I thought about what Ruth said once. Years ago, when Diane was small and the business was struggling, and I was working nights and doubting everything. "The people who stay, Graham. Those are your people." She was right. She usually was. I got out of the car. I went inside. I turned on every light on the main floor, all of them, because I felt like it. I put the kettle on, and I stood in the kitchen I have had for 30 years, and I breathed. The card was still in my pocket, the heron, the 2 sentences. I opened it, and I read what I had written. Then I walked to the dining room table, the one Ruth picked out at a shop in Huntsville back in 1998. and I set the card against the fruit bowl where I could see it. Blood doesn't make a family. Showing up does. And the people who don't show up, who use the door as a test rather than a welcome, they've already told you everything you need to know. I had built something in this life, and I had protected it. That would have to be enough for tonight.